Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Nonprofit Show. I know this is going to be a great episode for two reasons. We've got Scott Brighton on, well, three, I guess. Scott Brighton, CEO of Bonterra. But in the green room, he complimented me on my glasses, so that's a good way to start. And then he told me that his wife is the CEO of a nonprofit. So I'm like, this is my guy. He's walking along the journey with us. But more importantly, we're going to be talking about data. Oy, Scott, thank you for walking us through this.
Well, thank you, Julia, for having me. As you mentioned, my wife is a head of a nonprofit and a big fan and listener. So I haven't told her that I'm going to be on. So this will be a nice surprise for her for a future listen.
She'll be like, wow, honey, there was this dude who had the same name as you who was on. So yeah, this is great. Well, it's just a thrill to have you on. My team was like, oh, wow, Scott Brighton is booked. You're going to have to really be sharp, Julia, on the day he's a guest. And so I was like, okay, so let's hope we can spark this up. You know, we always spark up every day with this amazing group of presenting sponsors. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Interim Executives Academy, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Friday. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. But more importantly, I want to welcome Scott Brighton, CEO of Bonterra. Hey, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Well, I am too. I want to back the bus up first and ask you to tell us what Bonterra, what you do, and talk about this framework that you and your team have created before we get into the meat and potatoes of our discussion today.
Yeah. So Bonterra is a software company. We focus on social good, and we have a number of different products, but to sort of simplify it, really we operate in three areas. We have software that nonprofits use to fundraise through all their myriad fundraising channels, individual giving, grants, events. We have software that nonprofits use to manage resources that they might have out in the field, say working at a homeless shelter, for example, and report on outcomes for funders. But importantly, we also work with funders themselves and help them give money away, either through grants or through employee giving programs. And this is corporates, this is large foundations, even public sector organizations. And so really the macro problem we are trying to solve, Julia, is how do we bring funders who tell me their biggest problem is how do I more effectively give money away together with our nonprofits who are like, how do we build relationships with funders? And how do we create that connection so that they can cultivate those relationships and grow them over time?
You know, it's so funny that you would say that because I feel like that's the dirty little secret in the funding on the funding stage. I have so many funders, and I'm talking about, you know, private foundations that are pretty significant that will come to me and say, I don't want anyone to know this, but what's your advice on, you know, helping us manage, you know, and are working with these nonprofits? And I'm frankly, a lot of times I'm shocked. I'm shocked that they have these issues because I always think, you know, I'm like everyone else. I put these foundations on this pedestal and I think, well, they have it all because they've got all this money and they have all these resources and they're just going to be giving the money away. And honest to God, it always shocks me when I hear this. And this is not a new thing, Scott. This is not a new thing. So
no, it's, you know, it's funny. I was having dinner with the executive director of a large foundation of a tech billionaire. And his mandate to her is, I want to give away all my money before I die. And she's like, oh my God, that's, you know, tens of billions of dollars. It's a very hard problem, right?
It is.
Yeah, right. So.
Yeah, it is. I think that a lot of times we don't realize it, and so yeah, that's cool. That's a conversation for another day, my friend. We need to get you back on to discuss that because it's a real issue, and it's absolutely fascinating. But we're here today to talk about this new report that you just you and your team are debuting. It's a 2025 impact report. Can you give us a rundown kind of on like why you do this and what are some things that are going on?
Yeah. You know, at Bonterra, we see almost 500,000 philanthropic transactions every single day. And nearly 10% of all philanthropic activity in the United States, if you put aside government funding,
Mhm.
runs through our various software products. So we have this like incredible view of what is happening in philanthropy. And there are just tons of insights and patterns in that data. We have a data scientist group, and we charge them with dig into the data. And we're not looking for, how much is philanthropy growing or the things you see in a lot of reports. What we're really looking for is what insights can we derive that successful nonprofits who are growing faster than the industry are doing differently than other nonprofits that may not be. And so really this report is about digging into the data, seeing the winning patterns and trying to understand what distinguishes, what tactics, what behaviors really distinguish the really successful nonprofits. And it's tons of really interesting nuggets in the report.
I love that you do this. I love that you have released this information. We'll talk about how you can get access to this at the end of the program. But, thank you for doing this. I feel like in our sector, we spend so much time on emotion and that we think we know what's going on. And we don't really back it up and look at the data, right? It's a lot easier for us to kind of go with our gut. And so I really appreciate that we have these studies coming about so we can take a look at it. So one of the first things that you recognize is this call for diversification.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that, because this is not a new clarion call.
No, it's not. I mean, if you look at what's been going on in social good over the last, few decades, you have seen a pattern of concentration. Used to be 2/3 of Americans gave in any given year. That's down to less than half. Used to be 1/3 of Americans volunteered in any given year. It's now less than a quarter. And during that time, philanthropic activity has continued to grow slowly. So the net impact of that is everybody has fewer, larger donors. And it's understandable why that's the case. It is easier for a nonprofit to manage a smaller number of bigger donors than it is to manage a very large number of small donors. So it's understandable. And look, nonprofits are resource constrained.
Yeah.
But the implication of that, I think, has been sort of made viscerally clear this year in particular with the changes in the federal funding appetite, where 1/3 of nonprofits with revenue over $1 million derive income from the federal government. And we have some customers that were seeing 90% of their funding wiped out overnight. And so it was a very sort of visible and important moment to focus on. You really do need to build fundraising diversification. And by the way, I understand that that's easy to say, right? And much harder to do. But one of the advantages with the rise of AI, and in particular agentic AI, is the ability for that new technology to expand fundraising capacity in ways that software alone really never enabled. So we do believe this is the moment where fundraising diversification is possible and is being enabled by these new technologies that we're releasing right now.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. I love that how you framed up the reality of donor stewardship, and that it is easier to kind of look at your portfolio with a smaller number of people. You can feel like you're in control versus the other avenues that we go down, especially with monthly giving or some of these programs that we can get engaged with. It used to be a heavy lift to get that monthly donor system going, and now we can manage that just so much easier. And so very interesting. When you talk about this diversification.
Yeah.
Are you finding that there's like a percentage of, what's comfortable, or is it just like get out there and start doing different things? Do you have a guide for us to follow?
I every nonprofit has a long tail of small donors.
Right?
And really, it's about, okay, I don't have the resources to enable attention individually on every one of those and from sort of a manual way.
Mm-hmm.
But if you use technology, you can pull from the data, back to data being our topic today,
Mm-hmm.
and understand insights on how to optimize communications for that individual donor without a lot of human touch. As an example, one of the technologies that we've recently released is something called Optimized Ask. And it's very simple. It's looking at the data when I'm interacting with this particular long-tailed customer or donor, how much should I ask for?
Interesting.
And we can come up with that answer based on what we've seen behaviorally from donors that look like that with nonprofits that look like you. And what we found is if you ask for the optimal amount, the average yield on a donor goes up 11% a year, which is material, right? Just by asking for the right amount of money. And so it's those kinds of patterns that exist in the data that, if automated through technology, enables that long tail of funders to become an increasing part of your fundraising base.
Wow, I love that, because think about how much, I'm going to call it out, anxiety that we have as professional fundraisers trying to figure out what to ask for.
Right.
And generally there's that discussion, I think of all the board meetings I've been in where somebody like throws a packet out on the table and says, this is who we're going to ask this month, and this is what we're going to ask for. Do you have any thoughts? And then
Right.
we're expected to go around the room and say, oh, I know him. He has no money. Or I know her. She's
Yeah.
loaded. Or it's so
And by the way,
ridiculous.
that probably can work relatively well at the high end large donor level, right? Where you sort of know the people, but at the long tail where you need data, you need insights derived from the data.
Yeah. And I think you need success. I think
Yeah.
once you see something like that play out, then it probably, Scott, empowers an organization to be using data in another way,
Mm-hmm.
and saying, look, this worked. Okay, where else can we get this technology to work? Because I don't need to tell you this, but the nonprofit gasp sector is really slow, has been slow to adopt technology. I mean, I feel like everybody out there has like leaned in except our sector. So I love hearing these things. I really do. This is something that I'm really interested in. I want to spend some time on, because you say the future of nonprofits is local. And I mentioned this in the green room. This is not what I've been hearing or witnessing. So, wow, take me to school on this, because I am fascinated by this concept.
Yeah. Well, what we see in the nonprofit ecosystem is just a massive growth in the number of nonprofits, right? We're up to nearly, in the United States, 2 million nonprofits.
That's right.
10 years ago, it was half that.
Yep.
Most of those nonprofits are small, right? 90% of the 2 million nonprofits are less than 5 million in revenue. And as a consequence, they are all focused generally on specific causes in specific communities.
Mm-hmm.
There's a good and the bad in this design, right? The bad is it creates complexity and diseconomies of scale and perhaps competition between different nonprofits for funding. But the positive is this hyper-local notion where when you are small and when you are focused on a individual community, you really get to know what's going on there very well. One of the things that we're working on, which is designed to leverage the advantage of this sort of hyper-local idea, is we're working with a very large foundation, wants to attack the community violence problem. They recognize if they're to attack that problem, not a simple problem, there are justice reform issues, there's education issues, right? There's healthcare issues, and the right organizations to work with are going to be different by US city. We're providing technology that enables all these different nonprofits across all of those different sectors to collaborate, measure progress the same way, they have the same metrics, such that these large funders now have the confidence to plow in large amounts of money, knowing that all these different nonprofits are collaborating and working together on the problem. So all of a sudden you've taken something that might be a disadvantage, lots of small nonprofits, to something that's a huge advantage because of their insight into what's going on in the community.
Wow. So how do you see that those smaller nonprofits embracing that or understanding that? Is there a disconnect at all there?
You know, the major change that they need to make is we need to get them all speaking the same language, measuring the problem and seeing the problem in the same way. Because only if they're speaking the same language are they identifying where you need to focus, where we're making progress, where we're not making progress, and being aligned across all those different areas. And so the incentive is, of course, the large funder that gets unlocked by virtue of them being willing to speak the same language. So we found that there's an inherent desire to collaborate, a recognition that they need to partner in order to solve these problems more effectively, and then it unlocks the large amounts of funding by virtue of them doing so.
You know, it's interesting. I was speaking at a fintech conference just last month in Nashville, and I was chatting with a group that was from the East Coast.
Okay.
And they were telling a story about how in their area there was just an explosion of shelter services, and they were all kind of doing the same thing, but not really. But trying to work together, but not really. And funders came forward and said, we want you to form an association. And if you're not in this association, we're not going to fund you.
Right.
And it was like a shock because some of these shelters were, faith-based, old, long-standing. They had great track records, but they had worked by themselves.
Right. And look, all these problems, they're complex, right? And no single nonprofit organization can attack it on its own. And back to the conversation I was having with the Tech Billionaires executive director, she's like, I want to give away hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I can only do that if I've got lots of different organizations working together that can absorb that kind of funding to make impact. And I think that's what's really motivating funders. Give more money away, right? That's what they want to do. And they need this collaboration in order to do that.
Right. Well, and I think that's one of the beautiful parts of a data forward society. Yeah. Is that now we have the ability to measure impact, right, as opposed to the feel good or the emotional or the value proposition that's very personal and very internal. We can go forward and say, this is what's going on. And I think nonprofits forget that funders have their own metrics and goals that they need to report out on.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's not just that simple.
No, some of them they're subject to audits, right? Some of them, right? From their boards.
Yeah. It's really, really interesting. Okay. It's a problem I want to have. I'll man up to that, but, but yeah. Okay. Let's talk about, this is another campaign that you're doing, which I find fascinating. Bonterra is running a campaign 3% by 2033. What does that mean?
Yeah, this is really our internal galvanizing mission. It's really the way we talk about inside the company what we're trying to achieve. And this is the idea that, look, over the last 50 years, philanthropy has grown at a rate of roughly US GDP, 2% a year for 50 straight years. And this is while per capita GDP, or the wealth of the country, has increased 7x. So we're lagging, right? We're not giving more as we get wealthier. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how to use technology, and more importantly, how to use our data and the insights within it to change the trajectory of philanthropic growth. We talked about optimized ask, right? And how that's increasing donor giving by 11%. Well, that gets us nearly a quarter of the way there just on that one idea and insight. And there are others that we are bringing to the table, like bringing agentic fundraising, where you can have technology that will scan your data, look for opportunities to convert individual donors into sustainers, and suggest programs that you could run to make that happen, right? So this is our reason for being as a company, and how we get and the passion within our organization to try to change the curve on philanthropic giving.
It's absolutely fascinating. Are you looking at this information based on Giving USA reporting, or where are you gathering your primary data to make these decisions and track this?
Yeah, most of our data comes from what we see, the
Okay.
transactions flowing through our system, which we actually contribute to Giving USA as part of our partnership with them.
Okay.
But yeah, as I said, we see 500,000 transactions every single day. And there's a tremendous amount of insight in those transactions about what's working, what's not working, under what circumstances.
How do you feel about this? Do you feel like this is going to be a steady, slow growth, or it's going to be have ups and downs, or what's your sense of this? Because 2033 is going to be here like that, even though it seems like so futuristic.
Yeah.
What's your sense of this, Scott?
Well, I'll tell you what gives me optimism.
Yeah.
And this may sound strange coming from the CEO of a software company, but I actually don't think software has been a perfect solution for nonprofits, because software requires work to get value. Now, the work you put in multiplies 10x, 100x, but the one thing nonprofits don't have is resources, right? And so having users to learn data, to enter workflows, right? To really understand how to get maximum value out of the software, it's not an ideal tool. But what I do believe is going to be transformative is agentic AI, these autonomous agents that can execute things like fundraising campaigns or caseworker programs on their own without software, operating directly on the data. And so now, instead of having design a campaign on software, you will have an agentic fundraiser have an insight, present it to a human fundraiser, see if that's an insight like we can convert these donors to sustainers, see if that's an insight it would like to pursue, and then recommend specific programs that it can then execute. It takes the software out of the equation, and all of a sudden it multiplies fundraising capacity rather than using resources like software does.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's so interesting. This might seem like a little kooky, but when I look at the trajectory of the nonprofit sector, I think that this time that we're living in is equal to the time when, kind of like at the turn of the last century, when we moved away from charitable giving and charitable outreach as a value proposition, to when we moved into things like substance abuse, mental issues that were health and science based, right?
Yes.
As opposed to saying, oh, that's a bummer. Nobody should be, suffering alcoholism. Then there was this like point in the mid part of our century where we were like, okay, alcoholism causes all these other problems that we can measure, and it's a stain on society, and it's a disease versus only bums drink, right? Which is what we thought as a society. And right. I feel, Scott, that this is where we are with data science in the nonprofit sector. I feel like this is like going to take us from here to here and completely transform the way we think about programming and delivering services.
It's a fantastic point. And what you're sort of getting at is the focus on root causes, right? Versus just symptoms. And you can see those kinds of root causes in data relationships, right? Which enables us to get to what the real problem is. And it's back to like the story we were talking about with community violence. Some of those things are dealing with symptoms, healthcare as an example, but some of it is dealing with very, root causes and things like judicial reform or in things like education that are going to take many years to take root, but we believe have enormous long-term impact on the community violence problem.
Right. Well, I think we need to move away from the emotional value proposition, right? To something that's more intellectual,
Yeah,
as opposed to saying it's not right. We need to be able to say, well, it doesn't work for the betterment of society versus, the
yeah.
judgmental aspect. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, right? And it's hard because the emotion is a galvanizing force. I mean, I see it even within the walls of our company, right? A lot of
Yeah.
the passion and energy for what we do comes from that emotion, but at the same time, you have to channel it intelligently based on what the data is telling you and where the real essence of the problem is.
Yeah. Well, and for another day, because our time is almost up, but I feel like this is the secret sauce for next gen uh, donor stewardship, because next generations, younger people, expect solutions. They
Yes.
understand impact. And they're
Yes.
like, yeah, we're not going to just live because like that's not right. We want a solution. And why is a solution something I should buy into versus that issue? And
100%.
we have to be rethinking and recalibrating how we communicate to these donors, because with this massive transference of wealth that we are in the middle of in our nation, we're going to just lose out. We're going to lose these resources if we don't rethink this. So anyway, okay, Scott Brighton, my new best friend. Who knew? I love talking with you today. This was so cool. The CEO of Bonterra has joined us today, Scott Brighton. You can reach Scott and his team at bonterratech.com. And this is where you can also gain access to their amazing report, really digging into how things are changing, how we can be thinking about our beloved sector in the nonprofit world in a different, more educated way. And so super exciting, Scott, to have you on today. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Julia, you're a ball of energy. This was delightful. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks. You know how it is. I mean, here I am like standing on my soapbox talking about passion and we need to get more intellectual, but you're right. It starts with this passion and then we need to be more strategic with it, right?
Yeah.
We need to back up our passion and our excitement for our causes with metrics and and be less judgmental and be more intellectual, I think.
Yeah.
Not so easy to do, but it is important. So, hey, everybody, this has been a great conversation. And it's really because we have our presenting sponsors. Super important to know we've done more than 1,300 episodes, and our presenting sponsors exercise no editorial control over what we say or do. They're here to support us, but more importantly, here to support our sector. These amazing people come to us from the groups at Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Interim Executives Academy, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Friday. Scott, we end each and every episode with this mantra, and today I'm thinking about it in yet again a new way. And I say this a lot, but it's really true in my quirky mind. I hear this phrase differently, and it's exciting to me to be able to say this today. And it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well.